This story is based on real historical records, survivor testimonies, and documented wartime archives.
The first thing they do is count you. You are still trying to make sense of the parachute straps tangled around your arm, still listening for the sound of your aircraft somewhere above or below, still not entirely sure whether you are alive in the way that matters when a German soldier materializes at the edge of a field and begins to count you. 1. He writes it in a small book. You have become a number. Everything that follows in the next months will be organized around this number, which is the one true fact of your new existence. You are one, and you are accounted for, and you are not going anywhere. My name, whatever it was before I was shot down, stopped meaning very much almost immediately. What I became was a Kriegi, short for Kriegsgefangener, German for prisoner of war. The men who had arrived before me used the word the way civilians use their hometown, as a category, as an identity, as a joke that is not entirely a joke. You are a Kriegi now. Welcome to the compound. Watch where you step near the warning wire, or the guards in the towers will shoot at you. They are not always trying to kill you when they shoot. Sometimes they are just reminding you of the geometry of your situation. Stalag Luft III was located in a stand of fir trees south of the town of Sagan in Lower Silesia, in what was then Germany, 100 miles southeast of Berlin. It had been built by the Luftwaffe in 1942, and it had been built with a specific problem in mind. The problem was that Allied airmen kept escaping from other camps. The Luftwaffe's solution was soil. The ground at Sagan was composed of a specific pale sandy soil, loose and pale yellow, that made tunneling extremely difficult. Any tunnel dug in this ground tended to collapse. The builders were proud of this. They had chosen the site specifically for its soil, and they expected the soil to do what barbed wire and guard towers and searchlights alone could not. By the time I arrived, the camp held roughly 10,000 Allied airmen. They had been building tunnels for 2 years. My compound was the American South Compound, opened in September 1943. By mid-1944, the American officers alone numbered more than 3,000. The barracks were single-story wooden structures, each bunk room approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, holding 15 men in 5 triple-deck bunks. When the camp's population grew faster than the buildings could accommodate it, men slept on floors. The walls were thin. German winters in Lower Silesia were not. The Germans provided us with blankets, 2 per man. 2 blankets in a compound where the temperature in January dropped well below freezing. We supplemented with whatever we could accumulate: extra clothing from home, items from the Red Cross parcels, anything that could be layered over the blanket issue and tucked around the body at night. You learned to sleep in your clothes. You learned a great deal about cold. The day was organized by Appel. Appel was roll call. It happened twice daily, at 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Every man was required to be in his specific spot, not approximately in the right area, not nearby, not close enough. Your specific spot. The guards walked the formation counting. Some used their rifles to point at you as they passed. More as a gesture than a weapon, though the gesture was clear enough. When the count was wrong, when a man had overslept, when the numbers didn't come out right, when someone had miscounted somewhere in the compound, the formation stood until it was correct. Sometimes this took minutes. Sometimes it took considerably longer. Louis Pape, a P-38 pilot who kept a diary through his months in the camp, wrote it simply, "We lived Appel to Appel." That is exactly right. The day had no other natural boundaries. There was no sunrise that meant freedom. No sunset that meant rest. There was Appel, and then the hours between, and then Appel again. You organized your existence around those 2 anchor points, and made whatever you could of what fell between them. What fell between them was the question of how to remain a person. It sounds dramatic. It was not dramatic in any outward way. It was a very quiet problem. The danger was not that the Germans would do something to you, though they sometimes did, but that you would do something to yourself. The boredom was particular. It was not the boredom of a slow afternoon. It was the boredom of a slow afternoon that had been going on for 7 months with no foreseeable end. A man who has nothing to do for long enough starts to come apart in ways that are difficult to describe from the outside. The men who had been in the camp the longest understood this in their bodies. You could see it in the way they walked the perimeter track. The worn oval path around the inside of the wire where men walked for hours every day, not to get anywhere, but to keep moving. The compound had developed its own infrastructure against this problem. There was a library, books accumulated from home, from the Red Cross, from whatever sources could be found. By the time of my arrival, the library held several hundred volumes. There was a theater, converted from a barracks block, where productions were staged twice a week for whoever could get a seat. There were sports, softball, basketball, whatever the ground and the season permitted. There was Station KRGY, a public address system that broadcast music and what passed for news through speakers mounted in the compound. There were 2 camp newspapers, the Circuit and the Kriegi Times, published 4 times a week, filled with sports scores, theater reviews, compound gossip, and updates from the outside world that the editorial staff filtered carefully so as not to attract German interference. There were also what the men called hip pocket classes. These were informal teaching sessions that happened whenever 2 men had knowledge to exchange. A man who had been an engineer before the war taught another man calculus. A man who had studied law gave lectures on basic contract principles. Languages were popular. French, Spanish, anything that might be useful someday. When someday came, someone taught navigation from memory, using scratch paper and a pencil stub. Someone else taught carpentry. Pape, who had been an agricultural student, taught farming and electrical engineering. You sat in a bunk room on the edge of a triple-deck bunk, or on the floor if there were no edges left. And you learned something because learning something was a way of believing that you were going to use it. The YMCA provided wartime logs, journals, roughly 100 pages each of mixed paper and card, designed to be used as scrapbooks and diaries. The men filled them with whatever they had. Sketches, poems, lists of books they had read, lists of foods they wanted to eat, recipes, sometimes transcribed from memory or from letters home. An act of particular cruelty and particular hope at once. The logs were stored in cubbyholes in the walls, hidden from the periodic searches that the German security personnel, the Kriegis, called them goons and ferrets, conducted through the barracks. The ferrets were the ones most feared. They came with long metal probes that they used to tap the walls and floors, listening for hollow spaces. They were good at their work, but they could not search everywhere, and the men were inventive. Food was the organizing principle of daily life in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has not been hungry for months. The Germans provided rations. Bread, dark and dense, often adulterated with sawdust in quantities that varied by whoever had made that particular loaf, that particular week. Potato soup, boiled potatoes, ersatz coffee, which was made from roasted grains and tasted roughly like wood that had been left in water. Occasionally a thin meat broth. The daily caloric provision averaged around 1,600 calories, insufficient for a grown man, particularly one who was trying to maintain his physical and mental condition against the particular strain of indefinite captivity. The Red Cross parcels supplemented this. Each standard American parcel contained Spam, corned beef, prunes, chocolate cheese, powdered milk, biscuits, instant coffee, cigarettes. When parcels arrived reliably, which they did through much of 1943 and into 1944, one parcel per man per week provided roughly 1,800 additional calories, pooled with the German rations and cooked communally. This kept most men functional. The parcels were divided with a precision that would have embarrassed a Swiss watchmaker. Chocolate bars were cut with a blade so that each share was identical. Canned goods were opened and portions served with the solemnity of a sacrament. Anything extra, anything that couldn't be used immediately, was preserved against the possibility that the parcels might stop. In September 1944, the parcels were cut in half. German infrastructure was collapsing as Allied bombing intensified, and the fronts moved closer. Rail shipments became unreliable. The Red Cross parcels came through Geneva and then through German rail, and German rail was no longer what it had been. Half rations meant half a parcel per man per week. The German ration did not increase to compensate. You did the arithmetic quickly, and you went back to your bunk room, and you started rationing what you had in your personal reserve, and you thought about food constantly in a way that had nothing to do with pleasure or memory, and everything to do with the raw computational need of a body telling its owner that it requires more than it is receiving. George Holdefer, who was in a different camp, Stalag Luft III near Nuremberg, described it from the outside. on a ship home after the war. He wrote about slicing German bread as thinly as physically possible, getting 40 slices from a single loaf. He wrote about a watery vegetable soup the men called the Green Death, green in color, terrible in taste, eaten by everyone because everything was eaten. He wrote about waking up hungry and going to bed hungry and being hungry all day in between. What he described was what all the camps described, in slightly different proportions. Hunger was the atmosphere you lived in. And yet, the cigarettes from the Red Cross parcels had become currency. Within the camp, a specific exchange rate governed everything. Cigarettes for black market food, for extra clothing, for a German guard's indiscretion in looking away when something unauthorized was happening. The economy of the compound was complex and largely self-generated because the men had figured out that complexity was something to do with the hours between Appel and Appel. In March 1944, 76 men escaped from the North Compound through a tunnel called Harry. The tunnel was the culmination of months of work by hundreds of prisoners organized under a central escape committee headed by a British RAF officer named Roger Bushell. The tunnel was 9 feet deep and over 300 feet long. It took 11 months to dig. Hundreds of men were involved: diggers, dispersers of soil, tailors who made civilian clothing, forgers who produced fake identity papers, men who crafted German uniforms. The operation was concealed behind a vaulting horse, behind theatrical productions, behind the ordinary-seeming bustle of compound life. When it was done, it was one of the most complex, covert operations mounted by any group of prisoners in any war. Of the 76 who escaped through the tunnel on the night of March 24th, 3 made it home. The remaining 73 were recaptured. 50 of the 73 were shot. They were shot by the Gestapo on Hitler's personal order, which was delivered after the escape and after the recaptures, and which specified that the men were to be executed to discourage further escape attempts. The official German explanation was that they had been shot while resisting arrest or trying to escape again. This was not true, and everyone in the camp understood immediately that it was not true, because the ashes of the men arrived in urns at the camp shortly afterward, and were interred in the local Sagan cemetery in a ceremony that the remaining British prisoners organized, with the particular formality of men who have understood, something they cannot say aloud. The British prisoners in the North Compound built a monument to the 50 men in that cemetery. It is still there. For the American prisoners, the lesson arrived in a particular form. The Germans, after the escape, instituted an additional Appel, a third roll call, unscheduled, to occur at any time between the regular morning and evening formations. The men responded with passive resistance. They milled about. They did not stand at attention. They made it as difficult as possible for the guards to count accurately. It was an act of protest small enough to be legal and large enough to matter. A man who cannot choose when he stands up can still choose how he does it. On the morning of June 6, 1944, word came through the camp's hidden radio. The Allied camp leadership had known for weeks that an invasion was coming. The BBC news bulletins, decoded from broadcasts received on a crystal radio set that had been assembled from components smuggled in through Red Cross packages and bribed from German guards, were read in compound when no guards were near. On June 6, the leaders heard the news early in the morning and made a decision: wait for the Germans to announce it, so as not to reveal the radio. At 10 that morning, the German announcement came through the compound loudspeakers. George Vasile, a navigator who had kept a diary through his captivity, wrote down part of what the Germans said. During the past night, the enemy has made his long-prepared, and by us, expected attack against Western Europe. What happened next in the compound has been described by everyone who was there in the same terms. Men went wild. The flap meter, a running camp joke, a measurement of the current level of excitement, went to the highest mark anyone had invented for it. Cigars appeared from somewhere. Men who had been walking the perimeter track for months, with the slow tread of men who have nowhere to be walked it differently that day. And then, because nothing had actually changed, because the wire was still there and the guards were still in the towers and Appel was still at 4 o'clock, they came back. The men who had fought off the dissolution of captivity by making themselves small, by rationing their hope along with their chocolate, understood something that the men who had arrived more recently did not yet fully understand. The invasion was the beginning of the end. The end was not yet. Louis Pape wrote, "I have been speculating on the great moment around here. I can't imagine the reaction. Freedom simply means too much to us for our minds to comprehend it." He wrote this not on June 6th. He wrote it later, when winter had come again and the parcels had been halved and the news from the radio had been good for months without becoming liberation. The mind can sustain one kind of endurance when the end is invisible. When the end becomes visible but remains months away, the endurance required is different. Not harder, exactly, but different. Just before midnight on January 27, 1945, the order came. The Americans in the South Compound were performing a play. The compound's commanding officer walked into the middle of the second act and announced that the men had 30 minutes to pack whatever they could carry and assemble outside. The Red Army, advancing under Marshal Konev, was 16 miles from Sagan. Hitler had ordered the immediate evacuation of the camp. The guards had been warned. The men had been warned too, in a different way. The sound of artillery had been audible for days, growing closer, and everyone who had been calculating distances and timelines understood that something was coming. But 30 minutes. A man who has organized his life around waiting becomes a man who has accumulated things. Books, letters, camp records, sketches in his wartime log. The small, specific accumulation of a life that has had nowhere to go for months. 30 minutes meant choosing what to carry and leaving the rest. Most left their books. Most left their wartime logs, the YMCA journals that had absorbed 11 months of daily life, poems and recipes and sketches, and the names of men who had taught calculus from memory. Most left the records of who they had been inside the wire. They took their overcoats and one blanket and whatever food remained from the last parcel issue. The column of 10,000 men moved out into the dark at temperatures well below freezing, with 6 inches of snow on the ground. 2,000 prisoners were assigned to clear the road ahead of the main group. The march covered 34 miles to Bad Muskau, where the men rested for 30 hours before the next leg. They slept in barns, in churches, in any building that would hold them. Food was what remained of the Red Cross parcels each man had carried out of camp. When that ran out, the men ate what they could find. Some made makeshift sleds from whatever materials were available, boards, rope, anything that would slide on snow, and loaded their remaining supplies. Prisoners weakened by dysentery, frostbite, and a caloric deficit of months fell out of the column. Guards, in the chaos of a collapsing Germany, made little effort to stop them. The American prisoners from the South Compound reached Spremberg on January 31st and were loaded into cattle cars, 52 men per car. The journey to Stalag 7A at Moosburg, Bavaria, took days in conditions that Pape described, with the characteristic precision of a man who has been rationing his words, along with everything else, as deplorable. Stalag 7A was built to hold 14,000 men. In the weeks before liberation, it held 130,000. The camp at Moosburg had absorbed the evacuated populations of every stalag in the east as the fronts collapsed. Barracks built for 200 held 500. Men who could not fit inside slept in tents, in air raid slit trenches, on the ground. The compound resembled, as one account put it, a giant hobo village. The vermin that had been manageable at Sagan were not manageable here. The food situation, which had been difficult at Sagan, was considerably worse, but the artillery was audible and growing louder. And this time, the arithmetic of the distances made a different calculation. On April 29, 1945, the same day that Patton's forces liberated Dachau, elements of the 14th Armored Division attacked the SS troops guarding Stalag 7A. What happened when the gates opened has been described by every man who was there in the same way. Wild, delirious. Men swarming toward the tanks, emaciated and footsore and riotously happy. Pape was there and was liberated that day. He and a group of former Kriegies visited Dachau shortly afterward. He never said much about what they saw. The diary he kept through his captivity was written on toilet paper. He had no other paper available. When he came home, he kept the diary in a box in his daughter's possession. She never opened it until decades later, when she and her husband found it after her mother's death, and realized what it was. Photographed page by page, enlarged on a screen to read the handwriting, it contained everything. The apples, the food calculations, the hip pocket classes, the news of the invasion, the march in the snow, Most of the wartime logs left behind at Sagan were never recovered. The poems, the calculus lessons, the names, most of it is gone. What remains is what the men always knew would remain. The number, 1, accounted for, returned.